I now recognize Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to go back to Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, Madam Secretary. But my first question for you is a pretty simple one. It's basic civics. Which branch of government does the Constitution give the authority to interpret what the law is, the judiciary or the executive branch?
Sir, going forward, the interpretation of the law, you make the laws in this body. The judicial branch makes sure that they have integrity and they're applied properly to individuals.
So so I'm just going to take that as the judiciary branch. Now, let's focus for a second on what the judiciary branch has said about this case. We know the Supreme Court has said 9-0 that notwithstanding your statements under oath here today that Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was afforded due process, he was in fact not afforded due process, because then if he were, you would have seen the withholding order that did not permit him to be deported to El Salvador. Now you allege, and I guess the Attorney General alleges, that he's a member of MS-13. That may very well be the case. And if he is, now that that is a foreign terrorist organization, certainly the immigration laws would allow him, and in fact require him, to be deported. I certainly would support that. But the problem that we have here is what you allege, what Ms. Green alleges, what the Attorney General alleges, is not the judiciary. You don't get to decide whether or not he is an MS-13 member. And you don't have to take my word for it, because Judge Wilkinson, a Fourth Circuit judge, very conservative, addressed this argument. He said, the government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process. If the government is confident in its position, it should be assured that position will prevail in proceedings to terminate the withholding of removal order. Will you commit right now to give Mr. Abrego Garcia that process where you can prove your allegation that he is a member of MS-13?
Congressman, that judge that you just quoted did not say he was not a member of MS-13. Who did say that he was a member of MS-13 was law enforcement officers that encountered this indiviable.
Yeah, he knows that. This is a Fourth Circuit judge. He knows all of what the evidence is, and he's saying if that evidence... So you're not going to commit to follow this order? You won't commit to follow this court order?
By the way, he identified
Madam Secretary, I reclaim my time. Stop filibustering. Stop filibustering.
By gang members of MS-13.
Will you give Mr. Abrego Garcia the due process that the Supreme Court and Judge Wilkinson has required you to give him?
Abrego Garcia is an El Salvador resident who is in his home country. If he were to come back to this country, he would be immediately removed again.
How do you know?
He has received and been treated appropriately,
sir,
and he is not.
How can you say he's been treated appropriately if the Supreme Court has ruled 9-0 that he hasn't been treated appropriately? Why is your opinion better and have more authority than the Supreme Court?
Investigators, 2 judges, an immigration court that all said he was MS-13 and was removed from this country.
But you understand, that is you saying that. That is you saying that.
That is them saying that. This
no.
is investigators and law
that is
enforcement
you
officers
making that
in the case they
determination.
built against him. If you don't trust
the
our law
court
enforcement
has considered all that. The judge has considered all that, Madam Secretary. And if you would be quiet, because I'm reclaiming my time, you are not following this court order. But let's focus on the court order, because this opinion also says that to facilitate, which the Supreme Court is requiring, is an active verb. It requires that steps be taken. What steps have you taken to return Mr. Abrego Garcia to allow him to get due process?
Abrego Garcia is in his home country.
What steps have you taken?
If your continued advocacy for him were to...
I'm not advocating for him. I'm advocating for a court order, Madam Secretary. The court order says that you must take steps to follow the court order. You are here under oath. What steps have you taken to return Mr. Abrego Garcia pursuant to this court order?
It's got to be extremely discouraging to be one of your constituents. To see you fight for a terrorist like this and not fight for them is extremely alarming to me.
I'm fighting for due process, and that's under the Constitution.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Due process.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize...
What we just watched was more than just a heated back and forth between Congressman Dan Goldman and Governor Kristi Noem. It was a moment that cut to the very core of what it means to live in a constitutional democracy. Goldman wasn't simply sparring for political points. He was defending a principle that has held this country together for nearly 250 years, the guarantee of due process under the law. Let's break this down. Dan Goldman began with what should have been a straightforward civics lesson. In America, it's the judiciary, not the executive branch, not governors, not politicians, that interprets the law. That's a cornerstone of separation of powers. And yet, when Goldman pressed Kristi Noem to acknowledge this and commit to respecting a unanimous 9-0 ruling from the Supreme Court, she dodged. She tried to substitute her own judgment, her own political narrative, for the rulings of the courts. Now think about how extraordinary that is. The Supreme Court, with justices across the ideological spectrum, agreed unanimously that Kilmar Abrego Garcia had not been afforded due process. That's not a partisan decision. That's not a liberal court trying to coddle criminals. That is the highest court in the land, including its most conservative members, reminding the government that the Constitution applies to everyone, even people accused of serious crimes, even people alleged to be gang members. Because if we start carving out exceptions, then none of our rights are safe. Goldman's insistence wasn't about defending one individual. He was defending the integrity of the system itself. And this is where Republicans like Noem reveal their hand. They talk endlessly about law and order, about respecting the Constitution, about protecting freedoms. But when the courts demand that government follow the law, suddenly they are silent. Suddenly they deflect. Suddenly due process becomes an inconvenience rather than a necessity. This is bigger than one case. It speaks to a growing trend among Republican leaders, the willingness to treat the Constitution as optional, to ignore courts when they don't like the outcome, to substitute political rhetoric for judicial authority. That should alarm every single American, regardless of party. Because once politicians believe they can decide who is and isn't entitled to constitutional protections, then democracy begins to crumble. Goldman made an important point that often gets overlooked. Allegations are not convictions. Law enforcement can say someone is affiliated with MS-13, but in our system, that allegation still has to be proven in a court of law. That safeguard exists not to protect criminals, but to protect all of us. Because if the government could simply declare someone guilty without due process, then none of us would be safe from abuse. That's why Goldman's fight here matters so much. And there's also a political layer to this. Republicans like Noem want to frame Democrats as weak on crime, as defenders of people who don't deserve protection. But that framing is dishonest. What Goldman showed in this exchange is that Democrats are defending something much larger, the Constitution itself. He wasn't advocating for one man. He was advocating for the principle that no government official, no matter how powerful, is above the courts. What you saw in his tone, sharp, insistent, unwilling to be silenced, was someone calling out an alarming pattern. If Kristi Noem can dismiss a unanimous Supreme Court decision in this case, what else would she be willing to dismiss if it suited her politically? That's the slippery slope Goldman was warning against. And here's the takeaway for viewers. Due process isn't some abstract legal concept. It's the foundation that ensures fairness in our system. It's what protects you if you're wrongly accused. It's what stops the government from locking up people without evidence. It's what prevents abuse of power. And when politicians like Kristi Noem shrug off that responsibility, they're not just undermining one case, they're undermining every American's rights. That's why Dan Goldman's stand matters. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether one man is guilty or innocent. The question is whether we are still a nation governed by the rule of law, or whether we allow politicians to decide guilt and innocence on their own terms. So if you believe in fairness, if you believe in accountability, if you believe in the Constitution, this is the fight to pay attention to. Dan Goldman showed what it looks like to put democracy above politics. And that's the kind of leadership we need more of right now. If you want to keep seeing leaders who are willing to defend the Constitution, not bend it, stay engaged, stay informed, and make your voice heard. Because democracy doesn't defend itself. People do.